He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with over 26 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We are back, Henry, and today we have a guest, another guest from the UK, one of our favorite locales. This is Giles Edwards. He is the co-founder and creative director of an ad agency called Gasp and the host of a podcast called Call to Action. Let's join the conversation. Here we go. All right, we are back for another awesome episode of the Brief Brothers, and I'm really delighted to welcome a new acquaintance. Is Giles Edwards, all the way from, you are in London, right, Giles?
Yes. For the sakes of the purpose of the podcast, let's say yes. But Britain,
in the UK.
The UK, right. Across
We're
the
close
pond.
enough.
Yeah, so Giles Edwards is joining us. He is the co-founder of an agency called Gasp, at which he is also the creative director. And he is the host of his own podcast on advertising and creativity called Call to Action. So Giles, welcome to the Brief Brothers. We're so delighted to have you.
No, it's great to be here. I'm sure you've made a mistake asking me to come on, but I'm game if you are.
Yeah, okay, we can turn the record button off now. We're gonna talk about something else. Okay, I had the pleasure of listening to you interview a friend of ours and a friend of mine on your Call to Action podcast, Cameron Day. Cameron was a guest on our show, I guess last year, earlier this year. I've kind of lost track of time. You were approaching episode 100 for Call to Action.
Yes. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And Henry and I are just about ready to cross the 80th. We're approaching our 80th episode, so we're right behind you. It is kind of exciting that we can just keep this thing going. One of the things I loved about your conversation with Cameron, and I'm assuming you do this with all your guests, is you started off with 7 questions. And I don't have 7 questions to ask you, but I have a couple that I just want to throw out, and you can kind of answer them in any order that you want. And Henry has no idea that I'm doing this, so, play along, Henry. I guess question number one, again, you don't have to answer this in this order, but question number 1 is, as you're approaching episode 100 on your podcast, can you look back on those episodes and tell me what's the 1 or 2 things that has really surprised you the most about what you've learned from your guests? And 2, are you going to change direction? Are you going to kind of hold the course with your podcast? Go from there.
Go. That's a good question. Really good question, Howard. I think I'm surprised at the similarities that, to be honest, this is an observation I think I've made in my career outside of the podcast itself, but the podcast has given me the opportunity to talk to so many, wonderful and successful and creative misfits of all shapes and sizes. And I think the most interesting and most talented ones all seem to have taken a scenic route into the industry. I'm a big fan, and I think I could call him a friend now, of Steve Harrison. And Steve grew up in Blackpool, which is a fairly notorious seaside town in the UK that you may or may not be familiar with. And yep. Steve said something along the lines of, by the age of 13, the season's coming and going, all the tourism's dropping in, and seeing behaviour of all types, good and bad, from the great unwashed. He said he just knew a lot about life. And actually, it was that intelligence, and it was that experience, and it's that empathy, and it's everything around his childhood, which led him to believe he could do his role, which, like yourself, started off in a kind of direct marketing space. And it's an observation that's true, whether that's one example with Steve. Several other guests have been in different careers, and they've hopped in relatively late in their career. And the reason why that one stands out, and I think it's really important, and it's why we intentionally ask every guest to describe how they ended up in our industry, is because I see and talk to a lot of young people, not always young, inexperienced people trying to break into the industry. And there's a lot of anxiety around what the right way is to come into the industry. And I think what I've learned from almost 100 episodes now There's no right way in. There's no right way in. People don't typically take a linear route into the industry either. Some of them step in from all sorts of different walks of life, and actually I would suggest they're better for it.
That's been my observation as well. I mean, my personal anecdote is I got a degree in economics. I ended up working in retail management for Walmart stores, you know, biggest retailer in the world, walking around as an assistant manager in a 114,000 square foot Walmart store. And then I had a personal illness, some challenges in my life. By that time, I had owned my own retail store, a sports gift shop, and somehow ended up I was actively seeking to become a history teacher when someone invited me to work in an advertising agency as temporary help. And you know, here I am, and I started in advertising at age 26, so I wasn't really a young pup or anything. And you know, here I am 26 years later. So
you're not 52.
Yeah, my story is similar. I didn't get into the first agency job till I was 30. My first job out of college was working the front office as the assistant director of media relations for a professional soccer club in Tampa. The club, Tampa Bay Rowdies, and the league, the National North American Soccer League, are all defunct. They're all gone, right? Then I went to graduate school.
They were ahead of their time.
Yeah. Then I went back to
Try
school.
Again now, Howard.
Yeah, exactly. I went back to school, got a master's degree in, wait for it, poetry.
Nice.
Literary translation and poetry. And then I went overseas and studied at the Sorbonne for a short time, came back to the States and said, I got to pay off my student loans. And I started freelancing and advertising. And by the time I hit 30, I got my first job.
I'm shocked to learn that being a poet wasn't a viable method to gain income to pay back your student loans.
I couldn't even get a penny a word. Oh my goodness.
But what's good about both of your stories is that there's a real kind of you're in the trenches there, really, aren't you? Especially, I suppose, Henry, you know, running a retail outlet of sorts or a shop of sorts. You are front line with the consumer and the customer and the market. So actually that intelligence and experience that you gain from that is so valuable doing what we do. And no doubt the same is true with your experience, Howard. Maybe less so the poetry, but I think there's lots of good stuff about that as well. And that's the stuff that lots of people, they step straight into an agency from university and they don't have that. And yet they sit in an agency all day. They don't actually mingle with real people. The pandemic's made it worse because we're in a bubble in the city anyway, and now you're in a bubble within that bubble. And you don't have that. You're not rubbing shoulders with real people. And I think it's so valuable to bring that experience with you.
Although I have to say that although I never really had the entrenchment of working with actual customers and consumers the way Henry did, I read a lot of Charles Baudelaire. And you know, you're the editor and the contributor to your book, Your Copywriting Is, by one of your colleagues. And everybody I know who writes a book about copywriting quotes the French poets, right? Charles Baudelaire and Rimbaud and others. So I was deeply immersed in those guys. And so I understood that, but I was the exact opposite of Henry. I didn't have a connection to customers the way he did. So I came about it through a different route, but you know, I made it work.
So I was going to say, you know, you mentioned like being, you know, in contact with customers, but more than looking at them as customers, as you said, looking at them as people. Like you don't understand like the range of personalities and, you know, and weirdos and that are walking the streets until you open your doors of a retail store and have people walking through. You know, I mean, you really get to see, I mean, you're very rarely like analyzing and seeing like this, you know, there are YouTube channels about like the people of Walmart, like where they like film these strange people walking through the store and you're like, what did they think about when they put that on, the clothes that they're wearing or their behavior as they walk through the aisles. And that's not to say everybody's crazy, but you see this range of humanity that I don't think a lot of people ever, you know, you certainly don't see it going to schools, particularly, you know, if you go to elite schools and then university and, you know, you're kind of, you know, in a silo of people that are similar to you and you're not really out there with the general population. I think that really is one of the one of the challenges right now with the advertising industry, I fear that a lot of the practitioners in advertising are very much cut off and remote from everyday people. You know, and we've seen that, you know, the negative effects of that. Like, we're representing brands that we're supposed to be selling to these people, but we don't understand them, we don't empathize with them, we don't agree with them. And so I think that
we don't know them.
Yeah, we don't know them. I think that's a bad sign for the industry.
Yeah, and your point there about people walking around Walmart, whether, let's park the bit whether they're crazy or not. We can, you know, we can come back to that. But the thing that really teaches you, in my experience anyway, is just that indifference. So when we talk to clients, and even this can happen at a briefing stage, or this can happen in a presentation context or environment, is we always start with, you know, nobody cares about your ad. You know, everyone out there is indifferent to what you want us to advertise to them. So starting from that point, what do you want us to do? And it's just understanding that real people don't behave like most marketers and advertisers.
It's one of the things I found fascinating about this show that Henry and I started, you know, a year and a half ago, and that you're doing as well by asking your guests, you know, how'd you get started, and what, you know, what are the things that have influenced you, and how do you bring your life experience to the solving the problems that you do. Is that, you know, people say, how do you keep a show going about the creative brief? What can you say about the creative brief? And I agree, there are maybe a dozen things that we come back to over and over and over again that people struggle with the brief. But on the bigger level, we are talking about, are we paying attention to what the folks in Walmart are doing and saying, and how they're strutting around and doing these little things that may not have any apparent connection to the creative brief, and what goes into a creative brief are fundamental to what a creative needs to know to do the best work. You know, so there's a myriad, there's an unending amount of things we can talk about, because human nature, being what it is, gives us so many entrees into how do you solve this problem. You'd never run out of ideas or subject matter when it comes to what can you do to become a better observer of the human condition, and how does that translate into you describing what's going on for your brief to make the creatives more connected to solving the problem. It's just, we will never run out of ideas. We'll run out of things to say about those 12 elements. You know, how do you write a single-minded proposition? What's the best way to describe the customer? How do you do the insights? Those things have machinations, but it's like the bigger stuff. You know, it's the bigger stuff. We'll never run out of insights and topics and ways to talk about it.
Yeah, there were two parts to your question, Howard. I've just remembered I didn't really answer the second one, did I? That was,
I was going to get back to it. I was going to get back to it, but I'm glad you remembered.
Always listening. So in answer to that, I think, I mean, time will tell, and I don't necessarily know right now, but what I do know is that we've started to do a few, I guess, specials, you might call them. We've started a mini series within Call to Action called, it's in homage to Bill Bernbach. There's so many anecdotes about that great man that we could share, but one that always stuck in my mind, and I think is really, really relevant nowadays, as we're increasingly conversing in social media and environments where binaries are forced. But there's a story about Bill, and Dave Trott tells it really well, although I've heard different versions, so I'm not quite true on the exact details and which is accurate. But the story goes that Bill used to carry a card round with him, and he would reach for that card and just glance at it and put it back in his pocket whenever he found himself in a heated discussion where he was talking to someone who instinctively he disagreed with quite strongly. And he'd reach for this card, and on the card it said, "They might be right." And he would remind himself that they might be right, put it back in his pocket. It would almost reset his head and allow him to listen for longer to the other points of view and just explore that kind of grayscale. So we've started a They Might Be Right series in homage to Bill, where we are effectively picking up Twitter spats, so arguments and brawls that regularly break out in UK marketing Twitter. We're inviting them on the show. We're doing a very structured debate of sorts where we all agree to take it in turns to discuss, talk, and listen about whatever the hostile point might be. And we leave it there and we explore the grayscale, because I think nowadays everything is so increasingly forced into being black or white, when I'm sure you guys know the answer is always a shade of grey.
Yeah,
We
that's
could use
excellent.
about 300 million copies of that. We give 150 million to the Reds and 150 million to the Blues. And maybe it would work. I don't know.
So which topic in that series so far, have you found to be like, give us some anecdotes, like what are some of the topics that you've covered?
So we're only on two so
Okay,
far, sadly. There's more in the pipework. So there's one which is debating the idea of loyalty in marketing.
So there's the Byron Sharp view, right, which says loyalty is overrated. If there is loyalty, it's generally just habit. I'm going to buy this one because I bought it before. If it's not on the shelf, I'll buy another competitor that has mental availability. And so it's really, loyalty is really repeat purchase without like loyalty is this loaded word that means, oh, I'm loyal to you. Whereas in reality, most consumers just have a habit of repeat purchase.
It's rote.
Yeah, sometimes it's convenience disguised as loyalty, isn't it?
And so the opposing is, you want these brand ambassadors and these people that live your brand and they're very loyal, and you want to activate them because they can bring additional business and they're evangelists for your brand and all this. So you spend all this money on loyalty marketing. And Byron Sharp says you're spending money to sell people that would have bought you anyway. Right. So I think that's kind of maybe the debate in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong at all. All those points came up. We had a few low blows. We had a few people speaking out of turn. It was all in good jest though, and it was actually really, really good. And what I took away from it mostly was how much the three participants in this particular show, how much they each took away from points that the other people had raised that actually in a normal environment they would never have even probably heard. Not necessarily, and that's not a slight on them, just the nature of the way these conversations are staged online. And the other one we've recorded is agency side versus client side marketing, and it wasn't necessarily a topic that we would have thought was hotly debated or even relevant for one of our first shows, but it's a former client of ours who due to an acquisition is out of a job and was considering moving agency side, and he put out a very open-ended, harmless tweet asking for people to explain the differences between the two, and all of a sudden there are all of these offshoots brawls happening. So we're gonna
harmless tweet, isn't that an oxymoron?
Oh yeah. It's like a gas can or a petrol can in your case, and a book of matches nearby.
You're so right. Yeah, you're so right.
Going back to the loyalty thing at a higher level, I think it speaks to the fact, and I think that Byron Sharp in his book really kind of, the subtext of it is, there is so little that we agree to as an industry as being fundamental and correct. And I think the other person who kind of has that opinion, if you really look at them, is like Paul Feldwick, right? He's talking about like, how does advertising work? We don't have an industry agreement on how advertising works. The clients and the agencies don't have an agreement on how advertising works in the minds of consumers. Therefore, our advertising should strive to be X, right? Like it should strive. So Paul Feldwick, I think, would argue we should strive for it to be entertaining. I think Byron Sharp wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. He would say we should strive to achieve mental availability, and if doing that is through being entertaining, then great. But it might not be through being entertaining. So I think the real thing is, I don't know how we could go say modern advertising has existed for 100 years, let's say, how little agreement there is on fundamental things like, is there brand loyalty? How does advertising even work? What's your thoughts?
I'm probably in the camp of both those men you've just mentioned. I mean, Paul Feldwick talks superbly, articulately, very intelligently about fame, as we all know. You could argue that fame is mental availability, really. They're certainly a byproduct of each other. And I don't think either of them are wrong. I think that context dictates so much in advertising. A good example of that is, yes, brand loyalty does exist in certain contexts, in certain markets, with certain types of people, etc., etc. It doesn't mean to say that it's the answer. And I think that's one of the things that I've found. I mean, running an agency we've just turned 13 as an independent agency, and it's one of the consistencies we see, where things are often back to front, where people are looking for the answer before they've defined the question. I mean, you guys are the brief pros, you know this. But is loyalty is the answer? Is digital the answer? It's like, no, it's the wrong question. Let's rewind a few steps here, work out what's going on, diagnose the market, look at the whole context around that end game you're trying to achieve, and then we can use those building blocks. That's not really answering your question, I'm aware, but I think Byron Sharp's work, I think Mark Ritson's work, I think Paul Feldrick's works, I think, Bob Hoffman. So he had a great line about fame the other day that I read, which was, nobody ever got famous in the dark, or nobody ever got famous on their own. And so you can interpret that in a few ways, but of course, mass broad marketing, advertising is going to achieve fame of sorts, and that kind of shared understanding of a company, of a brand or whatever. So I think everyone is right in those instances, certainly those names. They're just kind of looking at it through different lenses, perhaps.
Yeah. I was about to mention Ritson, who sneak preview is agreed to be an upcoming guest on the Brief Brothers. Is one of my heroes, mentor. I was in the opening cohort for both his mini MBA in marketing and mini MBA in brand management. As I said, my background was in economics. But yeah,
we were classmates and we didn't know it, Henry.
Okay, there you go. That's awesome. That's great to know, fellow alums. But yeah, I do agree. I think we're starting to look at these issues and say, and the reason I thought of Ritson was when you were talking about trying to come up with answers without knowing what the question is. I mean, Ritson would say strategy before tactics. You got to look and see what's broken or what can we optimize in the business side, right? So that then we can figure out what the communications solution might be. And I think so many people have a title of marketing communications that they just immediately jump to what's the marketing communication solution without really saying, okay, we need to recruit new consumers, or we need to get repeat consumers, or we need to have more people know who we are, that we exist, or whatever. And those are very distinct problems that have very distinct solutions. And another thing that you kind of touched on, which I think is also fascinating, is there's like sub debates beneath the debates. Like, so Ritson very much at the beginning was very much in the debate about digital media and digital tactics versus traditional media and traditional tactics. And I think that kind of what got lost in that also was some of the, you talked about nobody gets famous in the dark, right? So Facebook initially was promised as this one-to-one communication tool or to talk to very small groups, which arguably you can do, but it's also become an incredible mass reach tool, right? So the things that we thought were true 5 years ago aren't necessarily true. I think YouTube is probably the world's largest television network right now. If you think about like how many views and but nobody thinks about them as television.
Especially the 12 to 17 year olds. The reports I've been reading just in the Wall Street Journal recently is that kids that age are stuck on social media. They almost can't help it. And the biggest cohort for YouTube is 12 to 17 year old. Which is, probably not surprising.
But what's interesting about, YouTube is an example, and it's a line that we use with a credit that has subsequently been added to Thinkbox in the UK. Their line is beautiful, which was TV's not dying, it's having babies. And so the fundamentals behind TV and that broad reach and that, it's undisputed in terms of it being a tool to drive fame. Of course it is. That applies to YouTube. And so actually you get people who are coming up and claiming to be I don't know, terms that make me feel physically ill, like YouTube gurus or YouTube growth hackers, whatever the nonsense might be spouted at the time. But actually, parking that nonsense for now, they're really just talking about TV. Of course, there's different contexts and there are differences between the two. But most of the time, the fundamentals remain true. The tools are evolving. They're not evolving as fast as people would like to claim when they sell their wares necessarily. But those fundamentals, which you're right, we don't necessarily always agree on, they are relatively constant.
I like to say, I gave this speech a couple of times about kind of pontifications of an old fart in advertising, and one of the things that I say is, you know, I'm a sailor. Like, I have a sailboat and I do a lot of sailing, so I watch a lot of sailing content on YouTube, and there's a lot of creators that are doing great stuff on YouTube, and I say, and I watch YouTube, and I have to see an ad before I could watch the content. And you know what? It looks a lot like a TV ad to me. And I'm watching it on my TV. So I don't know what the debate is here. Like, you know, but still we have clients that, you know, if we bring them an idea for a video, now it's, you know, video, because you can't say TV, right? And we bring them a video idea to fill out a media plan that already exists that says we're going to buy $10 million worth of television and this once every 4-year sporting event. We can't come to the creative presentation and say, here's the TV spot that's going to run in this TV broadcast in which you're investing 10 million. We have to come and tiptoe around and give them a creative platform. And this is how it's going to come alive in digital, and all beating around the bush when the biggest investment we're making is on the linear TV. We're living in an absurd time.
Yeah, yeah, we are.
So Giles, let me back up and ask you about the history of Gasp. You said that you've just celebrated your 13th birthday.
Yeah,
so
correct.
What was the vision when before you even opened the doors? What was your vision for this communication company, and how has it changed in the last 13 years? Is it someplace entirely different, or is it where you wanted it to be, or something in between?
The answer changes daily on that, Howard, and I don't know what the truth really is anymore, to be honest. I can tell you a bit about the background that might kind of help us all decide what the truth is. But I've been working in marketing and advertising for just over 20 years now, but I feel like I've lived it for more than 40. So my late dad was a notorious ad man of sorts. He had a fairly public spat with Charles Saatchi when he refused to sell him his agency. He made and lost millions, sadly, in that order. But I was always around it passively. I've got 2 older siblings who fell in love with the industry, started their own shop, sold it at different stages of their life, and they both fell catastrophically out of love with it and walked away. And without turning this into like an episode of Dynasty, I think that's the soap out there, isn't it? I didn't actually know those 2 siblings until much later in my life. So I guess it was either, you know, coincidence or fate, or I don't know, neither, that my career was already kind of leading in that direction. But my first agency job was quite an ambiguous studio role. And I was always described as annoyingly curious and curiously annoying, because I just wanted to know how to do everything. And I saw one of my old bosses recently, and he said that some of them called me the 100-question boy or something, because I just wouldn't shut up. I wanted to know how to use Quark Express, it was at the time. And
yes,
I wanted to know how to do everything from doing the backups on the server to artworking a piece of print, or, you know, everything. And I'd arrived at the agency already knowing how to use Photoshop better than, you know, most of the people in the studio. And I'd spend hours retouching high-end property photos to remove scaffolding, or retarmac the drive, or put a better car in the garage, or make it sunny. And, you know, absurd, really. They couldn't just take a better photo. But I suppose my only real talent, other than asking lots of questions and remembering everything, was ideas. And slowly I got exposed to more and more briefs. But after a few years and 70 billion questions, I I sort of became the person everyone went to find out how stuff worked, because I'd already sort of found stuff out. But there were so many questions that I got so irritated with that no one could give me answers for. And effectively, it was kind of uncovering a few flaws with, not all agencies, of course, but that particular agency that I worked at. And the answers to those questions were never forthcoming. They were ones that just couldn't be answered in the studio. And they were, you know, why is that the brief? Why isn't the client doing this? How is this brief informed? Where's the research that's led to this brief? And I guess I just fell out of love with it quite early on, you know, 3 or 4 years into my career. So decided to start an agency. I mean, naively, of course, but I kind of learned by doing. And I thought, well, I'm going to start an agency with my wife. She wasn't my wife at the time. And I've been trying to use Gasp, I suppose, to fall back in love with the industry, possibly. That's the short version.
Has it worked? Has it worked?
It's working. It's working. I've recently started telling people that I hate this industry almost as much as I love it, which sounds pithy, but it's the only way I can articulate it. Like this, I have so many frustrations with the industry as a whole. I see so many errors everywhere. I see so many flaws, whether it's the billable hour or free pitching or the problem with ageism, and it really, really grates with me. And rather than, and don't get me wrong, I'm very happy, probably too happy to bitch and moan about the industry, but I've kind of turned a corner a few years ago where I just want to try and fix things. So the model that Gasp works to, for example, we don't have a day rate. We don't use the billable hour. We turn down all pitch opportunities, and we explain why. And in explaining why we're not going to partake in a free pitch, you either stop a really bad conversation or you start a really good one, because the client understands, and then you find some common ground. So it's definitely working, and that's what's led in part to the books. It's what has led in part to Call to Action, because it was my way of thinking, I'm getting older and more cynical and more frustrated. I need to try and create some form of change. I'm not going to be able to do that, but if I can capture people who I really admire, who I know are really smart, and I put a microphone in front of their face and make them as loud as possible, we might, you know, slowly create change.
Yeah, I think you summarized what a lot of people feel about this industry. We love advertising, but we're constantly pissed at it. Right?
Yeah.
We've got a lot of stuff. It's like what other industry allows me to sit back, put my feet up on the desk, and just think about interesting ways to sell a product and get paid to do it. But then there are all the other hassles that come with it: a bad brief, bad clients, they don't understand, you know, my own flaws as a creative. It's like I love it, but I'm pissed at it.
I liken it to playing golf, right? Like if you're a duffer like me, right? That when you hit the ball, it's so exhilarating when you hit it well and everything goes great. But those opportunities are so few and far between. It's like a constant battle. And then you get something great that happens, and you see the work and everything comes together. And then you go back to the foxhole and back to the battling the bad briefs or the bad clients, etc. So it's definitely frustrating in that regard. But I do really respect the approach that you've taken, which is to try to change what you can within the sphere that you control, and also to try to connect with people that have a similar philosophy. And, you know, I'm a big believer in that it's a pendulum. Always, like any trend that we see, there's a pendulum. Like this whole trend toward brand purpose, you know, and that's a whole other topic that maybe will be a great for maybe they're right episode, is about, you know, brand purpose. I'm starting to see the pendulum swing back. I mean, Mark Pritchard gave a talk at Cannes this year, you know, saying, you know, we got to get back to growth. You know, that's the reason marketing exists, is to grow these brands. We can do good with our brands, but we can't do it unless we're making money and unless we're growing. So that there's got to be kind of a recalibration about marketing and what its purpose is. It's not to save the world, it's to sell more product, and then maybe we can do more things that can help save the world.
There's lots of I mean, you're at danger there in a way, Henry, of opening a door that you probably don't want to open with me on brand purpose, because I'll rant for the rest of this episode about my feelings of it. And I have tried to invite people who are much smarter and more articulate than me onto call to action, so we can properly have that debate. And there's people like Nick Asbury, especially, who I recommend your listeners looking into. He has written a piece on brand purpose. The flaws, not entirely the flaws, it's very balanced, better than anything I've ever read, bar one paragraph in Steve Harrison's Can't Sell, Won't Sell. I don't have it to hand. I regularly quote it, but it basically goes on along the lines of, to the point that we shouldn't really be ashamed of commercial purpose, is let's not forget that every time we sell a product, the person in the shop, or the person who made the product, earns money. The person in the shop where it was sold, the person who sweeps the floor, the person who delivers the product to the shop. And it just very simply in one paragraph just explains that kind of drip effect of, or the ripple effect perhaps, of a sale, and actually the benefits that we're almost too ashamed to understand are probably very similar to what a lot of people like to believe when they talk about brand purpose, is actually that we shouldn't be ashamed of it.
Yeah.
That commercial purpose,
I mean,
helps people send their kids to school, you know?
Yeah, when I talk to college students, one of the things I ask, and this is something that evolved from conversations that Henry and I've had on this show, one of the first things I ask the students is, do you call yourself a capitalist? I cut right to the point. Now, a lot of kids don't really have a clear understanding of what that means, so we have to stop and talk about, well, what is capitalism? What is your understanding of capitalism? But even when they understand that it's, a voluntary product maker and a voluntary product purchaser get together and decide, I'm going to buy this product or I'm not going to buy this product. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that, but that's the essence of it. Once they understand that this is how this works, and I say, okay, how many of you describe yourself as a capitalist? And in a room of 20 kids, maybe 5 people raise their hand. Yeah. And then I say, well, maybe you should think differently about this career of advertising, because you are a multi-billion, almost $1 trillion contributor to the capitalist system. We're selling toothpaste, we're selling Pop-Tarts, we're selling tires, widgets, right? A lot of kids want to sell the Sierra Club, or they're, anti-racism. All of these things are good, no denying about that. But only the most senior folks at the biggest agencies get chances to wrap their heads around projects like that. Most of us have to cut our teeth selling beer and new tires and groceries at the grocery store. I worked on a retail account, right? Like Henry, and I worked on that account very early in my career. So yeah, it is interesting to see how there's a disconnect between what it is that we do and why we're doing it, right?
Yeah, I in that speech, that the famous old fart pontification speech, the first thing I tell them is, if you don't like capitalism, then you should be thinking about a different career. This is the speech I give to students. And within it, I give an anecdote. This was something that a colleague of mine made me aware of. I didn't know. He did a lot. It was a creative director from Argentina who was celebrating, I don't remember, it was like his 25th or his 30th anniversary in the business. And he wrote a long Facebook post in Spanish. So I translated it to English. And so this creative director, in this post, he gives an anecdote, and he says, a lot of people trivialize and don't see the value of what we do in advertising. And he says, let me tell you a story. We had a meeting where we were invited to go to the Nestle ice cream plant in Buenos Aires or wherever in Argentina. And the director of the factory asked who was in charge of the creative. And so I raised my hand, and he took me to the room like where all the workers were actually making the product. And he said, all of these workers here make this product. If you do a good ad campaign, we'll have another shift of workers that'll be here. He says, and if you do a spectacular advertising campaign, we'll have a third shift, and around the clock, there'll be people here working and feeding their families. And he says, I don't have anything to be ashamed of when I work in advertising. So I tell the students, I sleep well at night knowing that I'm helping people make decisions about things they want to buy from people who volunteered to their time in exchange for being compensated to make the stuff. I said, what's the alternative? That some entity decides for you what you can buy, and that there's only one brand or one choice or one, that to me isn't a viable alternative. So
Yeah, that's brilliant.
So look,
I
you
love
know,
that
Henry and I
story.
love to talk. Henry and I love to talk about creative briefs. And just a few minutes ago, Giles, you were talking about, you know, as you were moving into the industry, trying to fall in love with it, having struggling do it. You talked about, well, you know, what's the genesis of this brief, and where's the research that supports the argument of this brief? I want to ask you about the way you brief at Gasp. What have you learned about the briefing process as a creative who read briefs, and now that you are, you know, an agency founder and a creative director, what is the role of briefs where you work?
I've learned that I can't improve existing brief templates. And I also have learned that there's no such thing as the perfect brief template. That's probably not the best way of starting an answer. Apologies, but it's something that's true. It's almost like a box ticking exercise, I think, for any agencies, you know, new agency, to have their own what's the words?
Black box methodology for writing a brief.
Yeah, exactly that. Like, they have to invent their own way of doing things. And actually, we very proudly and openly sometimes use two brief templates. One's BBH from 1964-ish, I think, and there's another JWT brief template, which is from the 70s. So of course,
I love it.
You know,
Stephen King. Yeah.
Well, no, do you know what? It's not actually one of Stephen King's, but we do have Stephen King's planning guide. I have paid to get it transcribed so that we can actually have a proper live text version, as opposed to that dud PDF that always does the rounds.
So, yeah, the one I have with an alligator clip in my bedroom right now.
Yeah. I'll send you a Word doc. I'll send you a Word doc, Henry.
Wonderful. I would love that. Thank you.
Yeah, because actually that's
I would love to see it too. Yeah.
I'll happily share that. And I can't improve it, and I won't try and improve it because I'll fail and I'll look like an idiot. So there's a few things in that which, I mean, depending on the context of the brief, of course, they're not always going to be right. But what I love about those briefs is they both, in their own slightly different and distinct way, they both make it impossible to complete unless you've really thought about it. Whereas too often I see, and I know both of you have spoken, and there's that wonderful report I heard you reference in a chat with Dave Dye that you had, how many briefs people believe or perceive to be of a particular quality versus, you know, client versus agency. But both of these briefs force you to actually do a lot of thinking before it can be filled out, rather than just passing on a problem. And I think too often briefs are used as a way of literally lobbing a problem into a creative department without any intelligence.
It's a project start form. That's what it becomes, and it's like lowest common denominator. It's form I have to fill out in order to kick off this process.
Yeah, which is why I love Dave Trott's explanation. He said a creative brief is not about writing; it's about thinking.
Yeah,
that's what you're talking about.
We might come on to this, and you've kindly already mentioned copywriting is, but Andrew Bolton, who is the author of that book, we work together a lot. And Andrew won't mind me telling you this, and it's too late if he does. And to be quite frank, I don't care, because he slags me off all the time. But he's one of the most difficult people to work with because he refuses to read briefs. Now, of course, that's not completely true, because he'll read a text message, or he'll read a WhatsApp, or he'll read a tweet, and it forces you to brief him really in such a short amount of characters and words that of course isn't going to be ideal, but it forces you to make sure that the one thing you're asking him is the one thing you really need and want back. And I suppose the more you practice being able to distill something into that, that whatever the right terminology is, it could be the proposition, whatever the problem is, whatever the outcome is, or the objective of the brief. And actually working with him can be really rewarding, because you can take a brief that's written internally here, and we talk about trimming the fat with everything, whether it's trimming the fat on a brief or there's some client copy, and if you can cross a word out and you haven't lost anything, then that word doesn't belong. And we talk about trimming the fat as an exercise, and working with someone who's such an arsehole as Andrew forces you to trim all the fat until you've got something. And don't get me wrong, I'll send it to him and then I'll say, look, that's the essence, but here's some more context. And he'll claim he never reads it. He always does.
I'm going to get his email address and make sure he sees this episode.
Do you know what? He did a talk yesterday, apparently, to a big copywriting community, and he talked about me. So this is just me getting my own back. Although apparently he talked about me because I'm very good at briefing. But I don't believe that, because he once said I had the voice of a cartoon toilet brush. So
well, I disagree. But listen, I understand his thinking completely. I know a lot of creatives who will they claim that they look only at the proposition, or whatever you call it, the key selling point, the most persuasive idea. I like to call it the single-minded proposition. They claim that's the only thing they look at. I don't believe them for a minute. But I've also read, and I've had a little debate on LinkedIn with some, I don't even think they're creatives. I think they're more marketing folks who claim that they only show their creatives a single sentence creative brief, and that the creatives accept this. I doubt it. And I wrote a response, and I got a short conversation. He says, well, there's also some strategy documents and there's some other things. Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Right. There's an appendix.
It's not really a one sentence, but I get the idea. I get the sentence. It is about strategic reduction. It's not 12 pages covering your butt. It's get to the heart of it. And as Henry likes to say, it's the starting point. The creatives, but we'll take it where we want to. Henry will, the strategist or the brief writer can kind of nudge us maybe if we're getting way out of line. But Henry has said many times, and I agree with him, that creatives can come back with an idea that this doesn't really fit the brief, but it's a great idea, and you've got to be open to that. Yeah,
and it's so important. It's so important. The way that the BBH template that I share that one probably more than I do JWTs, is one of their questions is, what is the single most important thing this advertising should convey? That's how they said the single most, and that again could probably be better in many different examples, but it forces the person writing it to actually not cover their arse, as you were saying, or whatever. And it's so important to get that right. We did some brilliant work with a top law firm recently, and we were warned by their CMO at the time that we're not going to be an easy client because the nature of the business, very logical, very smart people. A lot of them are probably, by their own admission, quite cynical about marketing and what we're trying to do here. They're familiar with, some real top level, really top thinkers like the work of Byron Sharp. So they weren't necessarily ignorant to it. But what having a brief agreed and signed off by all of the partners allowed us to do, and it's something that we consistently try and do with every piece of work, every client we work with, because it gets rid of subjectivity. Subjectivity is such a problem in our industry. I don't like this because I don't care if you don't like it. It works or it doesn't. We always say that advertising should be like a parachute. It works or it doesn't work. Nobody likes parachutes. So having that signed off, agreed, simple brief allowed us to work really well and effectively with this law firm, because every time we presented, even a creative presentation, they all, without being prompted, referenced the brief and what they had agreed and signed off. And so the question in their head became, has this done that thing that we've already agreed to? Yes, okay, we approve it. And it was literally one of the best projects we've ever worked on recently, because of the brief.
Well, these are lawyers, and they write a version of a brief themselves, which is to summarize their legal argument. Now, they don't do it in a page. They usually do it in their chapters. They're like 20, 30, 50, 100-page briefs. But the point is still the same. It's what is the argument and what is the support for the argument. Now, that's one of the definitions that I use. In my training on creative brief writing workshops, I ask, tell me what you think a definition of a brief is. And they give me great answers. It's the North Star, it's a path, it's a direction, it's a blueprint. I say, yeah, it's also just an argument. It's an argument, and you need to support your argument with making a claim, and then you support your claim with evidence. And I said, I know that sounds like we're talking about a legal brief, but that's how it works. And then at the end, I say, I'm going to insert one word that I deliberately left out, and that is, it should be an inspiring argument. Because you want the creatives to start riffing on ideas right away, and the best arguments do kick them in the butt creatively. So, you know, and getting back to what you were saying before with the templates, I chuckled because, yeah, templates, I've heard so many times over the years, agencies or even clients saying, we need to get a new creative brief template. Ours isn't working. And I'd say, there's nothing wrong with your template. It's the answers you need to fix.
Yeah,
the answers suck.
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple of thoughts I have on the template. And one is, what you referred to, Giles, is I think there's a pressure when you are either a new strategist at an agency, or when you're starting a new, to put your rubber stamp or to put your mark on the process. And for a strategist, that is the design of the creative brief template. You know, what are the questions on the brief? And I think that most of briefs generally have the same questions, just kind of disguised a little bit differently. There have been some exceptions to the rule. I think in the 2000s, Crispin, Porter, and Bogusky had a 4-question brief that kind of had a different approach than what I had seen from other. But it's what Howard said, you know, it's not the questions, it's the quality of the answers, because the questions generally are similar in nature. It's like, and to the point of Howard said it's about thinking, not writing. I agree and disagree. I think first you have to do the thinking, but then you have to, a good brief writer is a good writer, has to articulate those ideas that he came up with in a way that is inspiring, that is attention grabbing, that is easy to understand, it's not convoluted. So I think there is a skill, a writing skill there, but it starts with, of course, with the thinking. And that's very different to what I said before, is like, if you're an account person who sees this as just a barrier to getting a project started, then you're just going to fill it in like you'd fill in a form at the Social Security office or whatever. Like, it's just, I need something,
driver's license.
I need something to put in the box. It doesn't matter what it is. That's the opposite of having a, you know, an inspiring creative brief.
Yeah.
And I have to give you credit, Giles.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I have to give you credit, Giles, for saying we don't need to invent this document all over again just because we have a new agency. I'm going back in history and using some great examples. Did you experience any pushback when you decided to do that?
Internally?
Yes, internally.
No, actually, no. I'm not sure whether that's surprising or not, but no. Don't get me wrong, I think year 1 and year 2, we were obsessed with everything being a kind of proprietary bullshit, and we had a template, and and you know what, we suddenly realized that actually, I think I was talking to a very talented strategist recently. I've seen, it's weird, I'm in a position at the moment where I have lots of mentees, and probably every single one of them are in a job that I definitely couldn't get. And I have to caveat every time we sit down with them about that, because it just seems absurd that I'm giving them advice. But one of them hadn't heard of Jeremy Bullmore. And it just, and yet they were writing about brand and they were articulating things about brand. And I said, look, just read Jeremy Bullmore, because I can guarantee you he's done it better than you can, which isn't a slight on your ability. But once you've got that, then you can move on and solve other problems. And actually, we've become so busy trying to invent our own things and our own templates, and ignore the, you know, decades of, whether it's 100 years or whatever it might be, the age of the industry. Really smart people have already done all that. So let's build. Let's not try and reinvent things.
Yeah, that's the big frustration for me with the industry is we're constantly reinventing the wheel, wasting a ton of time. And not just on the agency side, even if the agency gets it, a lot of times the client doesn't get it, and you have to remediate the client to say, hey, this is our philosophy. This is what we think is how advertising works, or whatever, or what a brief should be. You know, one of the debate that Howard and I had, that was the genesis of this podcast, was about whether the creative brief should be collaborated on with the client. And I told them, I said, in theory, it sounds brilliant. I said, in practice, these people are very much legalistic. They want to scrutinize every cross T and dotted I. They don't understand that this is supposed to be a document of that the consumer of which is the creatives, and that creatives don't think anything like they think. And that the more the input that a client has into a brief, the less likely it is to achieve what we want it to achieve. The client can give us their brief, and then I think the agency brief should be the agency's business. You know,
but Henry, Giles just disproved your point by saying that the brief that they wrote for their law firm, which they shared with their law firm, the law firm actually referred to it to make sure the creative was on point, which I think kind of, unless I misunderstood what you were saying.
No, there's certainly some truth to be honest, there's truth. I'm not trying to be diplomatic either here, because I'd love to start a fight between you two. But it's
yes, well, we don't fight enough.
Okay. There's truth on both sides. So in that example, the client had actually been through a really thorough. It's the sort of thing that Ritson would have actually sat down and looked at and smiled, you know, more than he probably smiles when he looks at most marketers' work, because the client had done a beautiful segmentation. They had done some proper research and diagnosis. Everything was textbook perfect. And actually to then take that to the stage of engaging with an agency, internally, they all had to agree on those stages. They all had to agree on what their chosen position was. So that articulation of their desired position in the market was the piece they had already signed off, which then fell into the brief. And so we intentionally used that as a break slide every time we were presenting, just to remind them, and all that stuff we've just shown you, all of that copywriting, all of that articulation, that's why we've done that. And they'd nod along and say, you're absolutely right, that's done that. So
but that speaks to a level of sophistication in the client, which is very, very rare. I mean, forget about a law firm, like no law firm has that. Like, but a lot of consumer brands, big Fortune 50 brands, don't have that level of sophistication so, and that was my debate with Howard, is like, in the real world where we're dealing with like a person, a mid-level marketer, who's the one who's evaluating this brief, who has no formal background in marketing, maybe came from R&D or sales or some other and happen to, there's role open in marketing in the, you know, they're going to be focusing on the wrong things on the brief, not looking at it the way it's supposed to be, which is, if clients looked at briefs and understood, it's like, hey, do you agree with the general direction this brief is going? I don't need you to agree to every line and every word and start parsing words on a brief, because we're just wasting time negotiating this brief, making it worse, and using time that could be used in creative development.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, because the bit the client should only really worry about is the bit that comes out the end. And I think we're all it's too easy, and we do it internally, and I see agency folk doing it all the time. And when I mentioned marketing Twitter earlier, they're always, you know, disagreeing about how to define what a strategy really is and all of this stuff. And I see it and I think, why don't you just do a fucking brilliant strategy and not worry about arguing about what the process might be? It's the same with client RFPs, right? And you may have spoken about this already, but when you're asked to fill out an RFP or a pitch document, which we used to do at an alarming rate at the agency I started at, you have to somehow describe your creative process. And it gets to the point where you almost think, we should give it back to the client and say, look, whatever you want it to be, just put that in there, because it's not going to make any difference to what we do, because what we do is slippery,
organic, ad hoc.
And you can't define it, but you need to define it. So you define it so we can get rid of this silly section. And I think it's too easy to get caught up in the process, when really the bit that comes out the other end is the bit that matters, isn't it?
I think that's...
Giles,
I think that speaks to, hold on, I just want to tack on one point. I think that speaks to a troubling trend that we see in marketing, at least in the US. I don't know if it's true in the UK, where we have procurement departments, and that's the word I was struggling for last week. These procurement departments that are in charge of buying, pallets of staples and copy paper, and they are also in charge of hiring ad agencies, which to me makes it, what expertise do they have? So in their mind, it's like, well, what is your process for blah, blah, blah. And so in their mind, it makes absolute total sense. But, you know, to a marketer, it's like, it's absurd.
Yeah, you're right. Procurement, of course, and to be honest, it's procurement departments, which I think in part have made it very hard for agencies to move past the billable hour.
Yeah. Well, Giles, I'm going to tell you a little secret, and please don't tell Henry I said this. This debate that we've had about, you know, collaboration, I actually agree with him, but don't tell him. Okay.
No, I won't.
Yeah, that wasn't the case 3 years ago when we were.
I know.
Texting each other
see,
at a rapid rate about like, no, that's not the way it works, Howard.
I know that. Well, the reason I presented this argument is because the company that I work for, the Association of National Advertisers, I'm on the faculty of their Marketing Training and Development Center, and I do workshops on writing briefs. They have a task force on how to write great briefs, and it's populated by CMOs and CEOs and some advertising folks, and they wrote this 17-page white paper that advocated for a single brief, not a client brief that with an agency responds to with a creative brief. They advocated for a single brief, and I thought it made sense. Well, we've debated this now. This is how the show started. We started this debate, and we've moved on to other topics, and we've come back to this debate many, many times. But now, 3 years later, I'm saying, Henry, I've learned from you. You're right. I'm the creative, he's the strategist, and I'm the guy who's got to work from these documents, or at least I did back in the day when I was, you know, a working creative. And I want to know what the strategist has to say, because he's got that distance, that arm's length removed from the client who is lost in the weeds about his or her business. So I've changed my mind.
The way I summarize it is, you would not bring a client in to see the first round of internal presentation of ideas to the creative director, right? Like that's like kind of a behind closed doors. The creatives sit down with the creative director and say, I have this idea, I have that idea. It's a very messy, dirty process in which there's going to be a lot of ideas that are non-starters from the beginning. There'll be some good ideas. There'll be things that can be shaped and molded. It's a very raw material at that stage. You wouldn't invite a client in to that and ask them to comment on that. And so what I'm saying is the creative brief is part of that. It's the first step of the creative process, in which, however, and to your point, it's a slippery, organic, messy, dirty process that frankly you don't understand, and you don't need to understand. All you need to care about is at the end, can we justify what we're going to present to you as the actual work? And so what I tell Howard is, a lot of times the stuff that I write in the creative brief will end up being some sort of setup or runway for the creative ideas when we get to the creative presentation. So it's not like the client's never going to see it, that they're going to see that thinking, but they're going to see it in terms of, we got your brief, this is what we heard, this is how we interpreted it, and here's our creative solution for that. And if I'm wrong as a strategist, then that's on me. But I'm also working within the confines of the brief they gave me. So I'm not, you know, doing it in the dark, and I'm never going to write a strategy that is contrary to what the client has put in their brief. If I think that their strategy is wrong, then I'm going to go back and challenge them on it and ask and get a clarification. So I always feel comfortable that the brief that I write, somehow the brief they write is usually this wide, and the brief I write is this, but it's within this. So it can never be wrong. And if I'm on another page, then I have to go back to the client and get that clarified before I kick off the creatives.
I think you may not be wrong, Henry. You might just scare the bejesus out of the client because you are so narrowly focused. That can scare a client easily.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I also think there's some strength in what you were just saying about, you wouldn't present what is in essence raw materials at that stage, that first presentation to a creative director. That in part is, we've always seen that as, and I think that's what you're alluding to, is that's your job. You know, that's the agency's job. That's the strategist, creative department's role, to distill that and to give it the direction to come up with the final thing that is ready to show. But that's why as an agency, we never present more than one option to our clients. We present them what we believe to be the right option. Our recommendation is
Are
this.
you hiring?
because actually,
Wow.
that's what they're paying us
That's
for.
gutsy.
They're paying us for our recommendation. They don't need to be involved in all of those parts that lead to us saying this is what you want to do. And as soon as, in my mind, and I'm always wary of absolutes, and this isn't always going to be the right answer, but actually, as soon as you say or this, you've just diluted your authority because you're not sure which is right.
Yeah. David Ogilvy had, I don't remember which of the two books, Confessions of an Ad Man or I don't, he had a line that I stayed with me forever. He's like, when a client doesn't like what we present, I always say, it's okay, you don't like our best idea. Here's our second best idea.
I love that.
But I would say you don't need to like it as well. That would be my response.
A man after my own heart. I wrote a piece on LinkedIn called "Strike like from your vocabulary as a marketer." It doesn't matter, you as the client, what you like. That doesn't matter. It's the question is this likely to solve the marketing problem? Is it likely to be received by consumers the way we want it to be received? Is it likely to work? Is it likely to move the needle? Likely is a better word than like what, you know, what I like, that speaks to a personal prejudice. Like, I like this movie. Okay, great. But that doesn't mean it was a good movie. It could have been a shitty movie, right? So what you can't argue with is this was a popular movie, right? Like a lot of people enjoyed and spent money to pay for this movie. So what you like and what I like, that all that shit is irrelevant.
Yeah, in fact, when I spoke to Paul Feldwick on the pod, I intentionally led the conversation to asking this point, because when I make this point, or have made this point historically, people have kind of pushed back armed with a bit of Paul Feldwick and, you know, fame driving campaigns that people, you know, like, I suppose, for want of a better word, or certainly enjoy, and that's partly why they remember it. But fortunately for me, and I wouldn't have shared this story otherwise, Paul Feldwick kind of agreed with my point, which was, it doesn't matter if you don't have to like or love an ad, and actually I'd rather you hate it, because at least if you hate it, you're going to remember it for hating it. There's a advertising mascot in the UK, and I assume it hasn't made its way to the States. If it does, kill it. It's an opera singer called Gio Compario, and he's the most annoying ad mascot of all time, and yet he's also one of the most amazingly effective ad mascots of all time, in part because he is so irritating. Yeah. So actually, and funny enough, my elderly mother, who is fast approaching 80 this year, she it's a soundbite, and I wrote this down and I use it in presentations. My mum, who couldn't give a monkeys about the advertising industry, says, I hate that guy, but whenever I need insurance, I think of him.
Yeah,
it works.
There's an old line in our business that said, better to be hated than ignored, right?
Right.
Well, and Dave Trott speaks about this as well. You know, he cites a study that, like, you know, something like 2% of advertising is remembered favorably, 4% is remembered unfavorably, and 92% is neither remembered nor. So, you know, at some point it's better to be remembered and not liked than to, you know, the example I give of this one, and it's our equivalent, I guess, of Gio Campari, is there was an ad campaign for a long time for this headache balm that you're supposed to rub on your forehead, and it was called what was Head On, apply directly to, and the commercial was 15 seconds of somebody saying, head on, apply directly to forehead. Head on, apply directly to forehead. And this thing would run on daytime TV all day long. And you could only imagine that they were selling the goddamn thing, because the thing ran for years.
Yeah. We do a segment of our show called Classics Creative Review. And we go back in time and review some of the better TV spots. Well, Henry and I are talking about going back in time and finding some of these awful spots.
But the ones, but that you remember.
But that you remember, right? So. Giles Edwards, we will neither hate you nor ignore you ever. You are a wonderful guest. We appreciate you giving us your time today. You are the creative director of Gasp, co-founder of Gasp, and the host of a wonderful podcast called Call to Action. Giles, thanks for being a guest on the Brief Brothers.
Thank you, guys. I've loved it.
All right. Good stuff. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.
Bye.
Go compare, go compare. Just be sure to go online to go